Giuseppe Caruso thought he was going to die in the Georgia heat. The Italian infantrymen had spent 3 weeks in the belly of a transport ship crossing the Atlantic, convinced each day would be his last. The Americans had captured him in Tunisia in May 1943, along with 275,000 other Axis troops, the largest military surrender in the war so far. He'd watched Rommel's Africa Corps disintegrate under an American onslaught so overwhelming it seemed like nature itself had turned against Italy. American tanks appeared from nowhere. American planes owned the sky. American artillery made the desert shake. Now, stepping off a truck at Fort Oglethorpe in northern Georgia, Caruso expected punishment. Revenge. The brutal treatment he'd been taught to expect from the decadent gangster nation. Instead, an American sergeant handed him a tray of food. Real food. Caruso stared at the metal plate. Roast beef, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, fresh bread with butter, a cup of coffee that actually smelled like coffee. His hands shook as he lifted the fork. In 2 years of fighting for Mussolini, he'd never seen a meal like this. The Italian army had fed him watery soup and stale bread. Officers got the meat. Enlisted men got promises of future glory. This was a trick. It had to be. "Mangia," said another prisoner, a Sicilian who'd arrived 2 days earlier. "Eat. It's real." Caruso ate. The beef melted in his mouth. He hadn't tasted butter in 18 months. When he finished, an American corporal asked if he wanted more. More? Caruso thought he'd misheard. The corporal repeated the question in broken Italian, gesturing at the serving line where other prisoners were going back for seconds. Giuseppe Caruso got more food. That night, lying in a heated barracks with an actual mattress, he whispered to the man in the next bunk, "Why are they doing this?" "Because they can," came the answer. "America has so much, they can afford to feed us better than our own country did." The numbers were impossible. The official daily ration for an Italian POW in Georgia was 2,800 calories. Back in Germany, civilians were surviving on 1,800. In Italy, soldiers at the front got 2,200 on good days. The Americans were spending $1.5 per day per prisoner, more than the Italian government had spent on its own troops. Multiply that by 425,000 enemy prisoners across America. Do the math. The cost was staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars in 1940s money. And America was doing this while building a Liberty ship every 42 hours, manufacturing 300,000 aircraft, training 200,000 pilots, and supplying 60% of all Allied war material. Giuseppe Caruso gained 20 pounds in 2 months. So did Mario Benedetti, captured at the same time. So did Franco Rossi. So did thousands of other Italian POWs who arrived at camps across Georgia expecting death and found abundance instead. At Camp Gordon, prisoners got pasta made with real flour and olive oil. At Fort Benning, they had access to libraries stocked with Italian books. At Fort Oglethorpe, the camp chapel held Catholic Mass every Sunday with a real priest. The psychological impact was devastating. These men had been told America was weak, soft, a nation of materialistic cowards who would crumble when confronted by fascist will and discipline. Instead, they discovered a country so powerful it could fight wars on 2 sides of the planet and still have economic surplus to treat enemies like guests. Private Luigi Romano wrote to his family in Naples, "The guards eat the same food we do. They have so much, there's no difference between prisoner rations and soldier rations. How did we ever think we could beat these people?" The answer was visible everywhere. American efficiency turned camps that could have been hellholes into functioning communities. Barracks had heating. Medical facilities had actual medicine, sulfa drugs, antibiotics, supplies that didn't exist in most Italian field hospitals. POWs who arrived sick or wounded received treatment that exceeded anything they'd gotten from their own military doctors. Major Maxwell McKnight, commandant at Fort Oglethorpe, recorded his observations. Within a week of arrival, 90% of Italian POWs were asking to cooperate. They weren't defeated, they were liberated. This wasn't accidental, this was strategy. At Camp Gordon, Captain Robert Fry found himself approving requisitions that seemed insane. Tons of flour specifically for making pasta, cases of olive oil, musical instruments so prisoners could form orchestras, art supplies, sports equipment. One requisition requested wine for a prisoner wedding ceremony. Fry approved them all. "This isn't charity," he told a confused lieutenant. "This is warfare. We're showing them what their government could never provide. We're proving that democracy outproduces dictatorship every single time." The cost breakdown was brutal mathematics. America spent over $1.50 per day per prisoner. Fort Oglethorpe alone held 3,000 Italian POWs. That's $4,500 per day for one camp. Multiply that across dozens of camps, and the daily cost exceeded $100,000 just for Italian prisoners in Georgia, and America did this while simultaneously operating 511 POW camps across 44 states, building 141 aircraft carriers, manufacturing 96,000 bombers, producing more steel than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined, maintaining the world's highest civilian standard of living. No other nation in history could have done even one of these things at this scale. America did all of them at once. The revelation hit Italian prisoners in waves. First came the shock of abundance. Then came understanding. They watched American soldiers argue politics openly, criticizing generals, questioning orders, debating strategy, without fear of arrest. In fascist Italy, such conversations meant imprisonment or worse. They saw Americans waste food, actually throw away uneaten portions, because there was always more. They witnessed black and white soldiers working side by side in the camps, a racial complexity that had no equivalent in homogeneous Italy, but still demonstrated organization on a scale they'd never imagined. They received letters from home describing starvation and bombing, while they themselves gained weight and attended camp concerts. The cognitive dissonance was complete. Everything they'd been taught was a lie. America wasn't weak. It was so strong it could afford to be generous. It wasn't decadent. Its abundance was the product of superior organization and industrial might. It wasn't morally corrupt. It treated enemies better than fascism treated its own people. Giuseppe Caruso stopped believing he would die. He started believing he'd been on the wrong side. The POW program cost America hundreds of millions of dollars. It required constructing entire camp infrastructure, training thousands of guards, organizing supply chains, establishing medical facilities, and creating administrative systems to track nearly 500,000 enemy prisoners. It represented less than 1% of total war expenditure. A rounding error. Pocket change in the greatest military-industrial mobilization in human history. America was so wealthy, so powerful, so organizationally superior that it could house and feed 425,000 enemies as a minor line item in the national budget. That wasn't just victory. That was dominance on a scale that had never existed before, and the enemy prisoners saw it all firsthand. They lived inside American abundance. They experienced American efficiency. They witnessed American generosity, and slowly, inevitably, they began to understand why fascism had never stood a chance. At night in the barracks, Giuseppe Caruso and his fellow prisoners would talk. They'd compare their treatment to how they'd been treated by their own army. They'd discuss the American guards who called them by name instead of numbers. They'd wonder how a country could be this rich, this organized, this simultaneously powerful and humane. The answer was always the same. America was different. America was something new in history, and America was going to win. Not might win, was going to win. The outcome was as certain as the sunrise. Because any nation that could afford to treat its enemies this well while fighting the most expensive war ever waged wasn't just winning battles. It was operating on a completely different level of civilization. Giuseppe Caruso ate 3 full meals a day, gained weight, and learned what defeat really meant. It meant discovering that everything you'd been fighting for was built on lies, while everything you'd been fighting against was built on abundance so vast it bordered on incomprehensible. The Golden Cage wasn't a prison. It was a revelation, and for 50,000 Italian POWs in Georgia, it was the beginning of a transformation that would turn enemies into the most loyal friends America ever made. Captain Robert Fry stared at the requisition form like it was written in another language. 300 pounds of semolina flour, 50 gallons of olive oil, 2 dozen mandolins, a wine press. "For prisoners," his supply sergeant said, not quite making it a question. Fry signed it anyway, because the directive from Washington was crystal clear, even if it seemed insane. Treat Italian POWs better than their own government ever did. Show them what America could afford to waste. At Camp Gordon alone, the monthly food budget for 3,000 Italian prisoners exceeded $135,000 in 1943 dollars. That's $45 per man per month, just for food. The Italian military had spent roughly 12 monthly to feed its own soldiers before they surrendered. America was tripling that expense on enemy combatants while simultaneously outproducing the entire Axis war machine. The math was staggering. Across all 511 POW camps in 44 states, America housed 425,000 prisoners at approximately $1.50 per day each. That's $637,500 daily, over $19 million monthly, nearly $250 million annually. And this was considered strategically brilliant, not wasteful, because every dollar spent was a bullet fired at fascist ideology. Sergeant Michael Torres watched the transformation at Fort Benning with his own eyes. The Italians arrived looking like skeletons wrapped in dirty uniforms, he later recorded in his diary. Within 3 weeks, they looked healthier than most civilians back in Italy. Within 2 months, they were actually arguing about whether the pasta sauce needed more garlic. The prisoners couldn't comprehend it. POW Franco Benedetti wrote home in carefully censored letters, "Mama, I know you won't believe this, but I ate roasted chicken yesterday. Real chicken, not the mystery meat we got in Libya. The Americans have so much food they throw away bread that's 2 days old. 2 days. Remember when we ate bread with mold on it and called ourselves lucky?" But the food was just the opening move in a psychological chess match that fascism never saw coming. The camps operated on a principle that seemed contradictory: maximum comfort, maximum productivity, maximum exposure to American values. At Fort Oglethorpe, Italian POWs earned 80 cents daily for labor. Picking cotton, harvesting peaches, building roads. That's $24 monthly in camp scrip, which they could spend at camp canteens stocked with cigarettes, candy bars, and magazines. $24 was more cash than the most Italian soldiers had seen during their entire military service. Major Maxwell McKnight, Fort Oglethorpe's commandant, understood the weapon he'd been given. These men fought for Mussolini because they were told America was weak, decadent, and dying. Now they're living better than they ever did in Italy, eating better than our enemies back in Europe, and getting paid for work that back home they'd do for free under gunpoint. The cultural exposure was equally deliberate. Camp libraries contained Italian language, newspapers, uncensored accounts of Allied victories and fascist defeats. Prisoners could attend movies, form orchestras, even stage theatrical productions. Camp Gordon's Italian POWs performed Il Barbiere di Siviglia to sold-out audiences of American soldiers and local Georgians. This wasn't kindness for kindness's sake. This was strategic dominance through abundance. The shock rippled through the prisoner population like an earthquake. Giuseppe Caruso, now well-fed and contemplative, spent evenings in the barracks listening to fellow POWs process their cognitive dissonance. "My father fought in the Great War," one prisoner said quietly. "He told me Americans were soft, that they couldn't take casualties, couldn't sustain a real fight. But look at this place. They're fighting Germany and Japan simultaneously, supplying Britain and Russia, and still have enough surplus to build us heated barracks with indoor plumbing. When's the last time you had indoor plumbing in Italy?" Another prisoner, a former mechanic from Turin, added, "I worked on Italian trucks that broke down if you looked at them wrong. Yesterday I saw American guards drive past in a Jeep. They ran it into a ditch as a joke, pulled it out with a chain, and it started right up. They have so many vehicles they treat them like toys." The numbers supported everything they witnessed. While the Italian industrial base produced roughly 11,000 aircraft during the entire war, American factories were cranking out 300,000. Willow Run alone built 8,685 B-24 bombers, more four-engine heavy bombers than Italy, Japan, and Germany combined produced of equivalent aircraft. POW Luigi Romano captured it perfectly in another letter that camp censors approved because it served American interests. "The guards here complain about their food. They actually complain. I heard one say the coffee was weak. I wanted to grab him and scream, 'Weak? You're drinking real coffee while my family in Naples is making it from roasted acorns.' But then I understood. This is their normal. This abundance isn't special. It's Tuesday." The psychological operation worked because it was true. Captain Fry kept approving those absurd requisitions because America's industrial capacity was so vast that spending millions on prisoner comfort didn't even register as a rounding error in the overall war budget. In 1943 alone, the United States produced 85,898 aircraft, 234 per day, 20,497 tanks, 17,993 artillery pieces, 2,654,000 tons of ammunition, 87,620 naval vessels of all types. The entire Italian economy couldn't match 1 month of American output, and America was using that surplus to wage the most effective psychological warfare in history, proving that democracy's productive power made fascist promises look pathetic. By mid-1944, cooperation rates at Georgia camps approached 95%. Prisoners volunteered for work details, provided intelligence on Italian defensive positions, and, in the most surreal twist, began asking American guards how they could stay in America after the war ended. Major McKnight wrote in his quarterly report, "We are not guarding prisoners. We are operating the world's most effective conversion program. These men arrived as fascists. They're leaving as believers in American democracy, and it cost us nothing more than showing them what freedom and prosperity actually look like." The strategy of kindness wasn't charity. It was dominance so complete that even America's enemies became its evangelists. The problem hit Fort Benning's command staff like a brick in January 1944. Operation Shingle, the Anzio invasion, was 60 days out. The 3rd Infantry Division needed Italian speakers. Not textbook Italian, but street Italian. The kind that could tell a genuine partisan from a fascist informer. The kind that knew which Sicilian saints farmers prayed to and which villages hated Mussolini's tax collectors. The Army had exactly 47 certified Italian instructors for the entire European theater. Fort Benning alone needed to train 2,800 men. Traditional language schools took 6 months to produce barely functional speakers. The invasion wouldn't wait. Colonel James Harrison stared at the requisition forms on his desk. Then he looked out his window at the rows of barracks housing 3,400 Italian POWs. Native speakers, educated men, teachers, professors, opera singers who could make Italian sound like music instead of military commands. The solution was so obvious it seemed insane. "We're going to hire the prisoners to teach our boys Italian," Harrison announced at the morning briefing. "Pay them camp scrip. Put them in classrooms. Let them show our soldiers how to talk like Italians instead of Americans butchering vocabulary." The room went silent. A captain finally spoke. "Sir, we're asking enemy soldiers to help us invade their country?" Harrison smiled. "Captain, 90% of these men are asking to cooperate. They're not our enemies anymore. They're witnesses to what happens when you pick the wrong side." Within 2 weeks, Fort Benning's recreation hall transformed into a language center. Camp Gordon and Fort Oglethorpe followed immediately. The program was pure American pragmatism. Turn a problem into an opportunity, then execute with overwhelming resources. Antonio Lombardi couldn't believe his assignment sheet. A literature professor from the University of Bologna, he'd taught Dante and Petrarch to Italian students for 15 years before Mussolini's army drafted him. Now he stood in a classroom with 23 American soldiers, ranging from farm boys to college graduates, all desperate to learn his language. "Buongiorno," he began, and watched them butcher the pronunciation. But they were eager. God, they were eager. The American students didn't just want vocabulary, they wanted context. They asked about regional dialects, about how Sicilians differed from Romans, about which hand gestures meant friendship and which meant insult. They took notes like their lives depended on it, because their lives would depend on it. Lieutenant James Morrison sat in the front row of Lombardi's afternoon class. He'd grown up in Kansas, never traveled farther than St. Louis. Now he was memorizing phrases like "Dove sono I tedeschi" and "Siamo americani, amici." Where are the Germans? We're Americans, friends. "Professor," Morrison asked one day, "how do I tell a fascist from someone who just wants the war over?" Lombardi paused. The question cut deep. "In Sicily," he said carefully, "most farmers never wanted this war. They hate the taxes, the conscription, the hunger. If a man offers you bread, he's not a fascist. If he mentions the black shirts unprompted, he's afraid, or a true believer. Watch the eyes when you mention Mussolini. Fear or contempt. That tells you everything." Morrison wrote it down word for word. 6 months later, landing at Anzio, that single lesson would help him identify a German observation post hidden in a village church. The information saved his platoon from walking into an ambush. The numbers from the program were staggering. By spring 1944, Fort Benning alone had trained 1,200 soldiers in conversational Italian. Camp Gordon added 800 more. Fort Oglethorpe contributed 600. The POW instructors achieved what traditional methods couldn't. Students reached conversational competency in 8 weeks instead of 14. The cost savings exceeded $2 million in avoided instructor salaries, textbook printing, and training facility construction. The military had created an entire language school infrastructure using personnel who were already housed, fed, and paid anyway. But the real value wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in cultural intelligence that couldn't be taught from books. Giuseppe Caruso found himself teaching not just language but psychology. His students wanted to know how Italian soldiers thought, what motivated them, what broke their morale. He answered honestly, describing the disillusionment that had spread through Italian ranks even before North Africa collapsed. "We knew we couldn't win," he told a class of infantry officers. "Our rifles jammed. Our tanks broke down. Our rations were sawdust pasta and ersatz coffee. Then we heard you had ice cream machines. In North Africa. In the desert. We thought it was propaganda until we saw it ourselves." The officers laughed, but one asked seriously, "How many Italian soldiers still believe in fighting?" Caruso considered the question. Maybe 10%. True fascists. The rest fight because they're afraid of their own officers or they're trapped. If you show them abundance, show them kindness, they'll surrender, not because they're cowards, because they're smart enough to recognize the winning side. That insight became operational doctrine. American psychological warfare units began dropping leaflets over Italian positions not with threats, but with photographs of POW camps, pictures of Italian prisoners eating pasta, playing bocce ball, attending Mass. The text was simple. This is how America treats its prisoners: safe, fed, respected. Thousands of Italian soldiers surrendered carrying those leaflets in their pockets. Franco Rossi taught conversational Italian to American military intelligence officers who needed to interrogate prisoners and interview civilian informants. His classes focused on regional idioms and the subtle ways Italians communicated loyalty or resistance through seemingly casual conversation. If a man calls you compare, Rossi explained, it means companion, a term of trust. If he uses signore, he's keeping formal distance. If he offers his family's food during wartime rationing, you've earned his complete trust. The intelligence officers took notes frantically. This was information that couldn't be found in any manual, taught by a man who'd lived the culture for 40 years. And the surreal nature of the arrangement wasn't lost on anyone. Mario Benedetti, teaching basic Italian to MPs who would guard future prisoners, wrote to his wife, "I spend mornings picking cotton for American farmers. Afternoons, I teach grammar to American soldiers who will occupy my village. They pay me 80 cents a day for both jobs. I've saved $47 in camp scrip. In Italy, I made less in a month of military service. This war makes no sense, but somehow I understand why we lost." The transformation worked both ways. American soldiers who initially saw Italians as faceless enemies began recognizing them as individuals, educated, cultured, often more sophisticated than the farm boys from Iowa and Alabama who now studied their language. Sergeant Michael Torres, who'd fought Italians in North Africa, found himself studying under Professor Luigi Romano at Camp Gordon. "I shot at these guys 6 months ago," Torres admitted to his family in a letter. "Now I'm learning opera lyrics from a man who sang at La Scala. He's teaching me Verdi between vocabulary drills. This is the weirdest war in history." The program's success created unexpected ripple effects. Fort Benning's commander requested additional cultural instruction beyond language. Soon, POW teachers were explaining Italian history, regional politics, religious practices, and social customs. American officers preparing for civil affairs duties in occupied Italy received crash courses in how Italian bureaucracy functioned, which officials could be trusted, and how to navigate the complex web of family and political allegiances that defined Italian society. Carlo Martini, a former schoolteacher from Naples, found himself explaining the Italian education system to American officers who would oversee schools in liberated territories. "Your democracy requires educated citizens," he told them. "Mussolini wanted obedient sheep. This is why your system will prevail. You trust your people with truth." We were fed lies. The validation came from the battlefield. When American forces landed at Salerno in September 1943, then pushed through the Italian campaign, soldiers trained by POW instructors consistently outperformed those with traditional language preparation. They secured cooperation from civilians faster, identified threats more accurately, and gathered intelligence more effectively. Captain Robert Fry, now overseeing the expanded program at Camp Gordon, compiled statistics that told the story. Students taught by POW instructors tested 40% higher in practical conversation skills. They made half as many cultural errors that could alienate civilian populations. And they developed empathy for Italians that made occupation duties more effective and less confrontational. "These POW teachers aren't just teaching language," Fry reported to his superiors. "They're teaching our boys that the enemy is fascism, not Italy. That distinction matters when you're trying to win hearts and minds, not just battles." By mid-1944, the program had expanded beyond Georgia. Camps in Texas, Arizona, and California requested Italian POW instructors for their own training programs. The model proved so successful that plans emerged to replicate it with German prisoners once the European War ended, though German POWs showed far less enthusiasm for cooperation. Antonio Lombardi stood in his classroom on a humid Georgia afternoon in June 1944, teaching his final class before the students shipped out to Italy. He'd spent 5 months with these men, watching them transform from Americans who couldn't pronounce spaghetti to soldiers who could navigate Italian dialects and cultural nuances. "Gentlemen," he said in English, then switched to Italian. "You are ready. You know our language. You understand our people. When you arrive in my country, remember this. Most Italians want the same thing you do, for this war to end. Be firm with fascists. Be kind to everyone else. Show them the America I've seen here. Show them why we lost." The students stood and applauded. Several shook his hand. One lieutenant, heading to the 5th Army Intelligence Section, asked permission to write if he needed cultural advice once deployed. Lombardi agreed, giving him the prison camp address. 6 months later, Lombardi received a letter from Lieutenant Morrison, now in Florence. "Professor," it read, "your lessons about regional bread customs helped us identify a German spy posing as a local baker. Your teaching saved Allied lives. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but thank you. When this war ends, come to Kansas. My family wants to meet the Italian who helped bring me home." Lombardo read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in his footlocker next to the other letters he'd saved during the war. The year was 1987, and Professor Giuseppe Caruso stood before a lecture hall at the University of Georgia, his Italian accent still thick after 4 decades. In America, he began every semester the same way, by telling students how he first arrived in Georgia 44 years earlier, in chains, as a prisoner of war. The students never believed him at first. This kind man who taught them Italian literature, who brought homemade cannoli to office hours, who teared up during readings of Dante. He was a former enemy soldier, but Caruso had the photographs to prove it. Black and white images of himself in 1943, gaunt and scared, standing in formation at Fort Oglethorpe. Then, pictures from 6 months later, smiling and 20 pounds heavier, teaching his first English class to American GIs. "America defeated me twice," Caruso told his students. "First on the battlefield in Tunisia. Then with kindness so overwhelming I could never return to the country that sent me to fight." The impossible payoff of America's POW strategy wasn't just winning the war. It was transforming the enemy into ambassadors who would spend the rest of their lives telling the world about American generosity. Over 95% of Italian POWs requested to remain in the United States after repatriation orders came in 1945. Read that again. 95% of captured enemy soldiers wanted to stay in the country that had defeated them. Thousands succeeded, legally immigrating once the paperwork cleared. They brought skills, culture, and something more valuable than both: gratitude. Giuseppe Caruso wasn't unique. Professor Antonio Lombardi, who taught Italian at Fort Benning during the war, returned to Georgia in 1949 as a literature professor at Agnes Scott College. Franco Rossi, the intelligence instructor from Camp Gordon, opened Atlanta's first authentic Italian restaurant in 1952. Carlo Martini, who briefed civil affairs teams, became a translator for the State Department and later a citizenship teacher helping other immigrants navigate the same system that had welcomed him. Mario Benedetti, the artillery sergeant who marveled at American waste, married a nurse from Augusta he met during a camp medical visit. They raised 4 children who became doctors, teachers, and engineers. His grandson served in the U.S. Army during Desert Storm, wearing the same flag Benedetti had once fought against. Luigi Romano, who wrote those letters about American guards openly criticizing their leaders, became a political science professor at Emory University. He spent 30 years teaching American students about the difference between democracy and fascism, a lesson he learned while being fed by the nation he'd tried to destroy. The numbers were staggering. Between 1946 and 1960, over 12,000 former Italian POWs immigrated to the United States legally. Nearly 4,000 of them settled in the South, with Georgia receiving the largest concentration. They became citizens, business owners, teachers, and neighbors. Every one of them remembered being treated better as prisoners in America than as soldiers in Mussolini's army. "We cost your country nothing and gave back everything," Caruso told his students. The actual math proved him right. The entire POW program, feeding, housing, educating, and employing 425,000 prisoners across 511 camps over 4 years, cost approximately $2.8 billion in 1940s dollars. That sounds enormous until you realize America spent $296 billion on the war total. The POW program was less than 1% of expenditure. A rounding error that bought permanent peace. Compare that to the cost of hate. Germany's brutal treatment of Soviet POWs created partisans who fought with terrifying ferocity, extending the Eastern Front by years. Japan's prisoner atrocities guaranteed that America would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. Every act of cruelty extended the war and multiplied the cost. America's kindness shortened it. Italian soldiers who'd been prisoners became intelligence assets during the Italian campaign, providing information that saved American lives. After the war, grateful Italian communities welcomed American investments, bases, and culture. The Marshall Plan found eager partners in men who'd already seen American abundance firsthand. The psychological impact was devastating to America's enemies. POW letters reached Italy throughout 1944, describing camp conditions. As Allied forces pushed up the peninsula, Italian soldiers surrendered in groups of hundreds, specifically requesting to go to the American camps we've heard about. Psychological operations officers printed leaflets featuring real photographs of POWs eating pasta, playing bocce ball, attending Mass. Thousands more surrendered. The German command noticed. Hitler personally ordered that German POWs were not to fraternize with Italian prisoners, fearing contamination by American treatment. It didn't work. German POWs at camps like Fort Benning saw Italian prisoners being treated exactly as promised by Geneva Convention, and better. Many requested the same educational programs, the same work opportunities, the same respect. After Germany's surrender, a different challenge emerged. Hardcore Nazis remained defiant, but regular German soldiers witnessed the same American abundance that had shocked Italians. Within months, cooperation rates climbed. The pattern repeated with Japanese POWs after VJ Day. American generosity became a weapon more powerful than any bomb, but the real victory was peace. Those 12,000 Italian immigrants brought families who became American citizens. They told stories back home about opportunities in America. When the Cold War came, Italy stayed firmly in the Western camp despite a strong Communist Party, partly because so many Italians had relatives who'd experienced American freedom firsthand. Caruso's interview in 1987, filmed by Georgia Public Broadcasting, captured the ultimate irony. "I came to America in chains," he said, voice breaking. "I left in tears because I had to leave. America showed me that the enemy of tyranny is not cruelty, but abundance. You defeated us not with violence, but with kindness." He paused, collecting himself. "How do you fight an enemy who feeds you, educates you, and then sends you home with money in your pocket? The answer is, you don't fight them. You join them." That interview became required viewing in college courses across Georgia. Students saw a former enemy soldier explaining why America won not just the war, but the peace that followed. The lesson wasn't subtle. Power without compassion is tyranny, but compassion backed by overwhelming power is civilization. The final statistics tell the story better than any speech. Of those Italian POWs who became American citizens, their children and grandchildren produced. Over 800 college graduates, 124 military veterans serving in U.S. forces, 89 business owners employing thousands, 43 elected officials in state and local government, 12 university professors. Every one traced their American story back to a grandparent who arrived in Georgia as a prisoner and stayed as a citizen. Giuseppe Caruso died in 1991, beloved by generations of students. His memorial service filled Glenn Memorial Church at Emory University with over 600 people. Former students spoke. Colleagues remembered his passion for literature. His children shared stories of a father who never forgot where he came from, or the country that gave him a second chance. The University of Georgia established the Giuseppe Caruso Memorial Scholarship for Italian Studies in his honor. The first recipient was his granddaughter studying to become a teacher like her grandfather. In the church that day, a retired Army officer named James Morrison stood to speak. He was 83 years old, his voice still strong. "Giuseppe taught me Italian at Fort Oglethorpe in 1944, Morrison said. His lessons helped me communicate with Italian civilians at Anzio and Rome. His cultural insights saved American lives, including mine." Morrison pulled out a worn photograph. Young Caruso and young Morrison standing together outside a Fort Oglethorpe classroom in 1944, prisoner and student, smiling like friends. Giuseppe always said, "I liberated him twice. First from Mussolini at Tunisia. Second, from hatred by treating him like a human being. But he liberated me too, from thinking of Italians as enemies instead of future friends." That photograph hangs today in the Italian Studies Department at the University of Georgia, a reminder of when enemies became teachers, prisoners became professors, and American abundance won the war.